Hello, everybody, and welcome to Nature Source Care. My name is Dr. Fonda Goldman. In today's talk, I was going to cover homeopathy for lack of faith. And so, specifically, this talk is about Bach Flower remedy Gentian. So, yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Just a few notes beforehand. The information presented here is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. For any symptoms that persist or worsen, please consult with a qualified medical professional. It is always best to determine the root cause of any disease and to develop a comprehensive treatment plan. And while homeopathy, Bach Flower remedies can be very effective, they may not be appropriate for everyone or as a single therapy, so please keep that in mind. Okay, so Gentian Bach Flower remedy. Just a few words generally. Bach Flower remedies, if you're not familiar, they're a kind of homeopathy, and homeopathy is a whole paradigm of medicine that's energetically based. It's considered an energy medicine. And so for more information about that and background about that, I would check out my very first Bach Flower video, my very first Bach Flower video about Walnut, which was all about like transition and new beginnings. But the general concept of Bach Flower remedies is that disease stemmed from an inner struggle of some kind. And I find these remedies to be particularly helpful in situations where the cause is more mental, emotional, or spiritual. And for more content like this, I would check out my playlist, either the Bach Flower playlist or the homeopathy playlist to get more of this kind of stuff. I've gone through most of the Bach Flower remedies. I only have a few left, but so it's pretty much it's a pretty almost complete library. Let's put it that way. So the keynote for this remedy, that might get you thinking about this remedy when you see it in yourself or somebody else, is a lack of faith. Okay, and the inner state of being that's problematic is that there's a lack of trust in some sort of higher power or higher order. Okay, so this doesn't have to be religious, but there's some, at least some thought that there's something outside of ourselves that's at work and at play and helpful and supportive. Okay, yeah, so more specific gentian symptoms, because it may not come out directly as, oh, I don't trust the universe or something like that. It rarely does. So what you might find instead, more immediately, is it might be the type of person who chronically or situationally needs to see something to believe it. Okay. Now this might come across and they might sort of present this as, well, it's the logical path or the analytical path or the reasonable path, that sort of thing. But the thing is, like, there are a lot of things that exist that we don't see. Okay. From emotions such as love to colors such as infrared rays. There are, parts of the ocean and parts of the Amazonian jungle that, we've never seen. And so it doesn't mean that things don't exist there. So it's not exactly a true kind of logic. It may seem like it, but no, not necessarily. And even like, again, true scientists. I know some people who like, they're like, well, if I don't read a double-blind study about this, then I don't believe it. And the thing is, it doesn't. True scientists would say, well, we don't have evidence of it, but it doesn't mean that it's not true. You know. So they would keep an open eye, and it's like, at least there would be a question mark, like, well, we don't know if it's true or not true because we don't have any solid evidence to support or negate this position. Yeah, so they're a little bit more on the, I would say, negative or kind of resistant side of that type of logic, which is, again, not, I think, completely true logic, actually. So this might, again, come across as a lack in faith in religion, specifically, but also like not necessarily religious, but like some sort of higher meaning or purpose in life. So you could also potentially think of this as like an existential crisis remedy. um, so yeah, again, it's just a lack of faith in some sort of higher order or purpose to all of this, or we just kind of bumping around without any real true meaning, or support. So they may have difficulty seeing beyond their own individual existence and experience. Okay, so a lot of times somebody, even if they're not kind of a chronically Gentian type person, sometimes what happens is they'll become Gentian because they go through some challenging life circumstance that they're not really able to make sense of. It's like, just seemed totally random. It really like was, disturbing to me in my mind and, my physical reality or whatever. And they can't seem to sort of rebound from that, maybe disappointment. Okay. So the other thing is that, folks in the state, they're processing everything through the mind rather than like the heart or the spirit and that sort of thing. So the thing is like, when the mind can't come to a logical conclusion, sometimes it jumps to a negative conclusion. Okay. And the other thing is that if somebody's always processing, it's like the wheels are always spinning in their head. That can be a really heavy energy. Um, it doesn't allow for things like joy and lightness of being and things. Like it's just like the machine is always running in their head. And those things too, it's like, joy and lightness of being. I mean, they're experiences. Those aren't things you necessarily see with your eyes, at least not directly, right? So, because of all this churning of the mind, they can feel isolated because they're sort of all their energies in their head and they're constantly sorting, slicing and dicing life and the situation and sorting through it, at least trying to. Um, and they can also become like somewhat depressed, okay, sometimes. So the other thing with all this, over analyzing is that they limit their possibilities because again, their mind, usually the mind only, if you're coming from a logical perspective or analytical perspective, usually that's based on your own experience. Okay. And, everybody's experience is different, right? Somebody who lives in Africa is going to have different life experiences than somebody who lives in Australia versus somebody who lives in, France. The culture is different, the expectations are different, the upbringing is different, the weather is different, all these different things. And so just because somebody has an experience, it doesn't mean that it's not valid or true or possible. Okay. And so by limiting, expectations to what somebody has already experienced, it actually kind of caps any potential growth or overcoming of negative situations or perceived negative situations. Okay. I mean, if somebody instead was working through intuition or working through the imagination, like people who like draw cartoons, like, I mean, that's not based on, a lot of it's not based on actual reality. Maybe there's an initial thought, like Mickey Mouse. I mean, that's based on some kind of mouse, but the character and graphic of Mickey Mouse did not exist except through somebody's imagination. So and it's like, then you can just get lost in it. It's like, well, does Mickey Mouse actually exist? Well, yeah, clearly Disneyland exists. You know what I mean? It's kind of like this ongoing, just sort of rabbit hole that's like got no bottom to it. So besides overanalyzing, somebody can become overly critical. Again, they tend to be more of the, well, if I don't see it, I don't believe it. If I don't see the double-blind study, I'm not going to believe it. But, I mean, again, from a science perspective, most science is at least 20 years behind current reality because it takes a long time to actually do a thorough double-blind study. The other thing is like, it's funny because I used to be in a PhD program in immunology. And one of the, it's kind of blew me away. One of the classes we took was an ethics class. And we had some people come from the NIH, National Institutes of Health, which is sort of the big, government organizing body for the sciences. And they ran this ethics course for us graduate students. And this is, a long time ago. But they said that, of all the, because people are like, well, it's not in a journal, it's not published, blah, blah, blah. even the articles, science articles that are published, peer-reviewed in scientific, publications, they said then 30% of the articles were fraudulent in some way. Like back then, it was more about like Photoshop. I'm sure it's more sophisticated now because the technology is more sophisticated. But people were like forging like data. And so I was just like, wow, well, what that means, 30%. So that means if you read 3 scientific articles, 1 out of 3 of them is not going to be based on actual science. And so even at least at the time, I'm guessing it's not better now, but who knows? Even with all the peer-reviewed studies and, still stuff was getting in there, basically scientific garbage was getting in there. But, once somebody has a title and a publication, people don't challenge it anymore. I mean, unless you're in the field, you know what I mean, typically. So, again, there's a lot of limitations to just, accepting things through logic. Okay. And not that we want to throw logic out the window, but again, when somebody's only functioning or, sort of engaging with life through that lens, it can be fairly limiting. Okay. So let's see, what else did I read here? So not only do they, they're overanalyzing, but they can become overly critical and like shut out possibilities. They can also be rather uninspired, I would say, like, because when somebody does things for inspiration, there's like this fire, this heat, this like vital force that's like kind of lit up. They kind of glow and radiate energy because on some higher level, these people are engaging with life and ideas, and thoughts or creative, you know, uh, direction. So again, besides not being open to more possibilities, they tend to be fairly pessimistic. They can also be quite lonely, because they're going to be using this lens, and perhaps a bit of a faulty or at least a simplified lens of life to analyze every, relationship they have. And for a lot of people, for somebody who's is working or kind of experiencing life in this way, it's hard to connect with them except intellectually. So they might, most of their relationships or activities might be related to, hashing out different ideas, but it might be devoid of more of a emotional center or spiritual center, that sort of thing. Additionally, all of this sort of like pessimism and stuff like that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Again, if you're limiting yourself, you won't ever try, take a risk. Say, well, I don't know if it's true or not, or if it's possible or not, but at least I'm going to try. Like a lot of times that you don't even get to that point. Right. They can be easily discouraged. So again, maybe they do try, and then if they come up against some setback, then they're like, well, see, I knew it wasn't going to work out. I knew it wasn't like the logical choice. And then they use that excuse as like, there are all sorts of obstacles and challenges in life, but instead of seeing it as just a bump in the road and keep on going, or maybe adjust and then keep on going, they use that moment as a way of justifying their resistance to trying something new. Excuse me. They can also be quite anxious because, again, if they don't have some sort of faith in some higher power or some higher order, whether you can call them, God, universe, nature, and people call it different things, it can make you feel like you're just this little tiny human being, almost like a little ant, like wandering around on the whole, the big planet Earth all by yourself with no help. I mean, that's a pretty, heavy and harsh kind of, almost prison sentence, I want to say. I mean, that's probably a little bit harsh, but there may be like no sense of connection to other people or again something higher, that's inspiring and supporting. or journey in life. The other thing is that, especially if this is more of a chronic situation, like maybe they experienced some health issue, or they were caring for somebody with a pretty serious health issue. Sometimes, or maybe they were like out of work for a long time or something like that. Sometimes that can turn into what we would call psychologically learned helplessness. Like maybe they were trying for a while and they were open for a while, but like because nothing was shifting in the way that they wanted, fast enough, they just sort of like maybe gave up or felt defeated, or just, it was just, they used that as evidence that, there was no logic. It was all just sort of random, things that we experience in life. Okay. And not, necessarily positive or helpful or joyful. Okay. They might also be like the type of people who are like, I told you so, you know, because they tend to be, their mind, they don't realize it. They think they're just being logical or scientific or practical. But again, their mind, sometimes it can be more of a defense mechanism where their mind is, the way that they're experiencing fear is that their mind is coming up with all these perceived obstacles. They may not actually be true obstacles. Um, and this can also result in like depressive type symptoms. But the thing is, there are several Bach Flower remedies for depressive type symptoms. And again, if somebody is depressed, Bach Flower remedies by themselves or on their own may not be appropriate. I mean, it might be better to incorporate them with a full psychological treatment plan. But um, with Gentian, there's a known cause or event, like a known trigger that sort of generated this sort of mindset. Okay. So the risk, if they don't take a remedy like this or get some other appropriate therapy, is their mind tends to be fairly dark, and they tend to have negative expectations and also limitations for themselves and their life. The potential outcome after taking a remedy like this is that they become more resilient in the face of obstacles, rather than letting these setbacks keep them back. They kind of think about it, process it, think about it. They're like, how can I just do better? Or maybe just try again. Maybe it was just a timing thing. Maybe they didn't actually do anything wrong. Maybe it's just timing. And then they try again, and, they keep moving on with their life. Rather than being so negative, they might be somebody who's like more able or likely to see the silver lining even in negative circumstances. Okay, they can be more optimistic and flexible. They might focus more on doing their best rather than a specific outcome. They become more tolerant of ambiguity. They might see setbacks as opportunities to learn instead of just, oh, it's not going to work out, and kind of, put a heavy judgment on themselves or the situation. And they can potentially start to live from a more holistic or integrated way. So not just through the mind, but like a mind, heart, soul, spirit combination of experiencing the world. Okay. On this slide, these are some other Bach Flower remedies you might consider. And most of these, again, I've done videos on. So any of these that I have a little asterisk next to, that means that the video's been published. And again, most of them I've already done. So let's just go through them pretty briefly here. So aspen might be a possibility. Aspen is a remedy for fear, but these people who are in an aspen state, they're more like a sensitive, anxious type, like more than like a negative-minded, critical type. So their mind is quite different. But the reason why they're kind of in an anxious state is that they're just so sensitive to everything, energies of all kinds, like people and animals and places and colors, that it's like overload for their nervous system. Then there's Cerato. Cerato is for when people are not trusting their intuition. And so the thing with Cerato, though, is when people don't trust their intuition, what they end up doing is they might end up asking other people their opinion. So that, I think, tends to present a little bit differently. Cerato people might seem lost or confused, but not necessarily depressed or hypercritical. It's going to be a different presentation. Another set of possibilities, and these four are in the same video, are elm, hornbeam, oak, and olive. These four Bach flowers are about for being overwhelmed and burnt out. So sometimes when we're overwhelmed and burnt out, like that'll make us negative, put us in a more negative state, like where I just can't do this anymore, I can't handle it anymore. Sometimes it doesn't even come to that level of consciousness. But excuse me, yeah. So is for people who kind of over-identify with a certain role, and they try to live up to that, in sort of a perfectionist way, and then they're not really listening to their body and their intuition about their own needs and staying balanced in the way. Hornbeam is more about overwhelm or burnout, like mental burnout, like students who are like studying too much and they just kind of fry their brain. Oak is for people who are like sort of dogmatic about certain goals in their life, and they may not be flexible in how they achieve the goal or whether they should even, continue to try to achieve their goal. And then they burn themselves out that way. Olive is for people who just overwork chronically, um, and they're just burnt out, like mentally, physically, spiritually. They're sort of gutted out. Then there might be impatience. I haven't done that video yet, but that's for people who just are not patient, frankly. So sometimes it's just a matter of, um, again, the time frame is not working for somebody. If they just hung in there a little bit longer, they'd be fine. But again, the Gentian type it's deeper than that. It's like it's not so much about timing. It's like, again, it's like I'm all on my own. I got to do this on my own. I've failed at this several times before. Like, what's the point? Nobody's coming to help me or rescue me or whatever. It's not meant to be. These are the sorts of things that they might say or at least think. Um, then there's Larch. Larch is for people who don't try, to kind of move ahead, but for different reasons. For Larch people, they don't kind of put themselves out there because they actually have an inferiority complex. So they may not feel deserving of winning or doing better. Mustard is for depression, but for no reason. I haven't done that video either yet. Pine's another one. Pine is for people who they may not put themselves out there, kind of like Larch. Larch is more about just feeling inferior. Pine is more about, they've done something in the past that they feel guilty or ashamed of. And then they kind of put this heavy, like mark on themselves. It's like, well, I've done this thing, so I'm not allowed to be happy or successful or something like that. So they're condemning themselves, which is different. It's more of an emotional. I would say Pine is more of an emotional type remedy. Larch is more of Larch could be emotional as well, but like there's some. I'd say there's more guilt and shame involved with Pine than Larch. Larch is just like, I'm just not as good as everybody else. May not be attached to guilt or shame. Walnut is for resistance to life transition. So sometimes, like, we don't even realize that, there's a certain level of unconscious fear that's holding us back from starting a new cycle or, embracing a new cycle of life, whether physical or emotional. And so that holds us back from really just setting sail into the next chapter. Then there's white chestnut. White chestnut is for repetitive thoughts. So this is white chestnut is more like analysis paralysis, where they just sort of cycle and cycle and cycle in their head. And they don't often come to conclusions, at least the Gentian person, they might analyze a lot, but then the outcome most often is like, well, it's not going to work. So why bother trying? So again, there's like this negativity as opposed to like white chestnut could be more of just like a very objective, like just the mind is just churning and churning, and doesn't settle on anything. Then there's wild oak. Wild oak can, represent people who are held back or hold themselves back because they don't lack life purpose or life direction. So they just don't know which way to go. It's not that they wouldn't try, but they're like, maybe they've tried this and tried that, and they're just not clear on their purpose, and that's really more the issue rather than it's not possible, but just more of a lack of clarity. So the other thing I wrote down here at the end of the slide is from an Ayurvedic point of view, and Ayurveda is traditional Indian medicine. So in that paradigm, it's a different paradigm of medicine, but it's also very energetic, mostly energetic. There are essentially three types of energies or imbalances. They call them doshas in Sanskrit. And these three imbalances are loosely translated as wind, fire, and earth. So wind is vata, fire is pitta, and earth is kapha. Okay, so and they each have different like kind of psychologies related to them. So of the three, wind, fire, earth, vata, pitta, kapha, the one that like if somebody has this type of mentality where they're over analyzing and being very negative and critical, judgmental of self or situations, whatever, that would most often be a pitta state, a high pitta or high fire state. Okay, now there are different ways to work with that from an Ayurvedic perspective. So if just as one suggestion, I have a video titled Ayurvedic Pitta Fire Diet. You can actually start to lessen the amount of fire in somebody energetically. So we're not just talking like physical fire, like inflammation, that may be true. But in the mind, pitta can show up as like having this edge, like the sort of cutting edge. People who have a pitta mind tend to be very organized, very logical, very analytical. They tend to be very skeptical. Like as patients, they're the ones who are going to like challenge the doctor the most. Um, uh, yeah, or maybe out loud or in their mind, they might just dismiss whatever the doctor says or advisor says. Um, and they can be really extreme and intense with their thinking. Okay. Um, yeah, like with their usually when they show up in my office, I always ask people what they eat. And when I get people who start talking about like, I don't eat this, I don't eat that, they're on a really like multiple elimination diet. Um, sometimes we would almost call them orthorexic, like maybe they're kind of obsessed about clean eating or, their mind tends to be focused on eliminating things that aren't clean, but they've lost the kind of primary objective of nutrition, which is to support, the physical body and the mind, just giving building blocks, nutrition for just basic functioning. And so they can get on these like very strict or limited diets or, um, yeah. So usually when somebody eats like that, I know that they have high pitta fire. Anyway, so again, if you come across somebody like this might be another avenue to pursue is Ayurvedic perspective on this kind of mentality. Okay, so as always, thanks so much for stopping by and listening to one of my talks. I have written a couple books on natural medicine, not Bach Flower Remedies, but other topics in natural medicine. If you're interested in that, they're available on Amazon. If you go to books and search under my name, you'll find them. Also, some of the photography in this talk and most of my talks, I do a lot of photography. So I have an online photography gallery and gift shop. So that's out there if you're interested in photography or looking for unique gifts for somebody. And then I also have another YouTube channel on Vedic astrology, which is ancient Indian astrology, more than 5,000 years old. And the name of that channel is Light Vedic Astrology. So anyway, other things I do that might be interesting or helpful to you. And as always, I hope you found this talk helpful, useful, and interesting to you as you learn to find more balance and joy and possibilities in life. All right. So take good care. And until the next one, namaste.